Hello there, AP Government students. We are going to continue on with some new material here. So last week we finished up Unit 3, Chapter 8. We talked about civil liberties and civil rights. And today we're going to get into Unit 4. We're going to look at Chapter 9, Public Opinion and Political Socialization. Two topics. We're going to put them together in a single chapter. And it's possible, depending on how I feel today, that we will just finish the whole chapter today, even with two different topics. It's a relatively short one. So we're going to move pretty quickly through this chapter and knock it out. And we'll combine chapter 9 and chapter 10, which is political participation. We'll put those together on our next assessment. So just giving you a heads up for what is coming. So first, we're going to talk about public opinion. When we talk about public opinion, we're just looking at how people feel about government. We're trying to get an understanding for where the American people are on a particular issue. And the number one way that we measure public opinion is through polling. So that can happen over the phone, that can happen online, but polls are a way to reach a large number of people to try to understand, in general, how does the American public feel about a particular topic, about a candidate, about how an elected official is doing in their job. So polls are the number one way that we measure public opinion. You can do other things. You can do like focus groups where you get a small number of people, maybe 10 or 12 people in a room. Then you can ask them questions. That makes it easier to ask follow-up questions and really have a conversation with people. So focus groups are smaller, they're less representative. Polls are a better way to reach large numbers of people, but they both kind of have benefits and drawbacks. So public opinion, we're looking at how people feel. When it comes to public opinion, you'll hear folks say we should just do whatever a majority of the people want. Measure what people want government to do and then do that. That is not the way government functions. If we did that, we would have very different policies in place. But there are some folks who kind of have this as their philosophy that government should do what the majority wants. In practice, we see a much more pluralist model, small groups, interest groups, minority opinions, the will and decisions of the Supreme Court really kind of guide policymaking, not just what a majority of people want. So again, when it comes to measuring public opinion, polls are our number one tool that we use to inform us about public opinion. Focus groups would be another one, but polls are the most often used. And we're going to look at a few different examples of types of polls. So there are benchmark polls. That's the first one you take. You announce your candidacy. You say, hey, I'm running for governor of Virginia this year. You hire a polling firm to see how you're doing, and they take what's called a benchmark poll, the first one, which tells you where you stand. Typically, candidates with a lot of name recognition tend to do well in benchmark polls. For the 2020 presidential election, with all the Democratic candidates who ran, Joe Biden was always doing the best because the most people really knew his name. He started way out in front because of name recognition. That's a huge benefit when you're in those early benchmark polls. Tracking polls follow the same questions over time. Most commonly, you'll see this with presidential approval ratings. So pollsters will send out these polls and ask people, hey, do you approve or disapprove of the job that the president is doing? And they ask that same question. They keep asking it over time so that we can watch what happens to a president's approval over time. You always want the best polls are random, meaning everybody has an equal chance of being selected. You don't want a poll that is self-selecting for participants. So the best random polls do random digit dialing, where they call up people randomly in a certain geographic area. That's the opposite of what's called a straw poll. In a straw poll, the people taking the poll, the participants volunteer to take it. They have to take that extra step where they volunteer to take the poll. Typically, straw polls are not very helpful. Random polls are much better. They give us a much better sense of the general public's feeling. With a straw poll, because you have to take that extra step of reaching out and volunteering to participate in the poll, it already skews your results. Whereas with a random poll, you're going to hear from people who are motivated. You're also going to hear from people who are unmotivated. And so you'll get a much more representative sample. Immediately after people vote, there are what's called exit polls. So typically in a normal year without COVID, there are folks hanging around outside polling places with a clipboard, and they will ask voters to take an exit poll. So why do we do this? They just voted, so don't we know what they think? Maybe, but not necessarily. We know what they think of the candidates. We know which ones they chose. Exit polls help tell us why. So an exit poll will not only ask who did you vote for, it will also ask demographic questions like age, race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, things like that. It will also get into what are the most important issues to you? What do you look for in a candidate? And so exit polls try to take the data that comes out of the election and give it some more context. And we get those polls immediately after voters have voted. And then you can have what's called a push poll, where the question is designed to change voters' opinions. A push poll would be like if I was going to poll you on the best superhero, and I said, hey, who do you think is the best superhero? Do you want a tough, intelligent, strong superhero with lots of experience like Batman? Or do you want a wimpy kid like Spider-Man, right? That's a push poll, because the question, the way it's phrased, is designed to change the voter's opinion. Obviously, that's an extreme example, and apologies to all the Spider-Man fans, but the you can tell from the way that the question and the responses are phrased that the poll itself is designed to shape your opinion. One of the things that we look for in polls are trends. So you can see this in a tracking poll, where what is happening to the president's approval rating over time? In general, is it rising? Is the president getting more popular? That might mean they are on their way to being reelected. Or in general, is it declining? Are they struggling? Is their message not reaching through to maybe new voters? Maybe are they in trouble when it comes to reelection? Or we can look at a trend for an issue over time. Perhaps this issue used to be really, really unpopular, but now it's getting more popular. That would be an example of following a trend in a poll. And good polls, reputable polls, will also publish their margin of error. So when you look at a poll, you should see a number with a little symbol next to it that looks like an addition symbol with a subtraction symbol underneath of it. And what that means is plus or minus. So if I'm president and my approval rating is 55, 55% of people, according to this poll, approve of the job I'm doing, with a margin of error of plus or minus 3, that means my approval rating might actually be as high as 58 or as low as 52. So margin of error is saying, hey, here's the number we ended up with, but because of the constraints and the limitations that come with doing a poll, it might actually be as high as 3 points higher or 3 points lower. 3 is a pretty common margin of error. Typically, you'll see plus or minus 3. Anything more than like plus or minus 5, after that, it really gets the poll, you really want to question its usefulness. But 3 is a pretty good margin of error. But that's an important thing to keep in mind, because you suppose a race is being polled, like a Senate race, for example, and one candidate is polling at 51% and another candidate is polling at 48%, and the margin of error is plus or minus 3. If you account for that margin of error, the candidate who seems to be ahead might actually be behind, right? Based on that margin of error. If they are the -3 and the other candidate gets a +3, then they'll swap places. So margin of error is something important to keep in mind when you're looking at polls. Uh, As far as reliable polls, there are a lot of garbage, trash polls out there in the world. There's a website that's on the previous slide. I put their banner here, 538.com. They look at polls, they do data analysis, they analyze polls, and they will tell you that the best polls are nonpartisan because the parties and the campaigns also conduct polls. You really want to take with a grain of salt any poll that was done by a political party or by a campaign. You want to be careful with that information. So the best polls are nonpartisan. The best polls have large, random, representative samples. So you want to look for a poll of, usually if you're trying to poll the whole country, man, you might want like 1,000 people in that poll. If you're going to poll a state, you're going to want a few hundred in there for sure. You want it to be random. Like I said before, everybody in that geographic area has an equal chance of being polled. And you want a representative sample, meaning the people polled look like the larger population that you're trying to apply um, the answers to. So that means racially representative, age representative. You want roughly half of your sample to be men and half to be women, because you want the people that you're polling to look like the population that they're being applied to. That's what it means by representative. Your questions should be clear, easy to understand, and unbiased, because the way a question is phrased can have a huge impact on the answers that you get. So you want your questions to be clear and unbiased. You don't want a push poll like the Batman Spider-Man example that I gave before. And a low margin of error, like I said, typically a margin of error around 3 is pretty good. And some reliable pollsters here, you'll hear names like Gallup and Pew pretty frequently. When it comes to polling Iowa, there's a pollster named Ann Seltzer who is basically unrivaled. So in the Iowa primaries, the Seltzer poll is the gold standard. In 2008, all the other pollsters in the Democratic caucus in Iowa said that Hillary Clinton was a shoo-in and it was going to be easy. Seltzer's poll came out and said, actually, we think this Senator Barack Obama is going to win the Iowa caucus. And everyone looked at her like she was a Looney Tune, and she was right. More recently in 2020, it looked like Democrats had a shot at flipping Iowa, like it was going to be close, but they were in play. And then right before the 2020 election, the Seltzer poll comes out and says, actually, we've got Trump up by 7% in Iowa. We don't really think Iowa's in play for Democrats. And the Seltzer poll was closer to what actually happened than those other pollsters that showed Democrats having much more of a shot. So Monmouth and YouGov nationally are pretty good examples. The New York Times and Siena College work together um, on a polling organization, so that's a good one as well. And you got to be good at math if you're going to understand polls. So 538 does this thing where they try to analyze each candidate's chances of winning. They take all the polls that they can get their hands on and they create a model out of it. And for example, in 2016, they showed Hillary Clinton with about a 2 out of 3 chance to win the presidency, and Donald Trump with only about a 1 out of 3 chance. And a lot of people looked at that and said, oh, okay, Clinton's got it in the bag, because people are bad at math. And so they saw 67% for Clinton and thought, oh, okay, she's definitely going to win. But of course, things that only have a 1 in 3 chance of happening sometimes happen. So that's what we saw in 2016. Just because a person is behind or doesn't seem to have much of a chance, it's still a chance. A few challenges, a few modern challenges to polling. The gold standard method of polling is to use landline phones, but I mean, who has a landline phone anymore? People are getting rid of their landline phones. I don't have one in my home. And so that makes it much more challenging because cell phones present their own issues. People live in an area that's different from the area code that's on their cell phone. That's like me. I have gotten calls before from pollsters trying to poll me for the area code uh, where I grew up. That's the area code my cell phone has. And so I always have to tell them, no, I'd love to take your poll because, I love a good political poll, but actually I don't live in that area anymore. And online polls, again, have their own issues, have their own challenges. Getting them to people is tough because email presents challenges. Trying to get people to click on your poll, that's a straw poll, so that's not going to be as useful. So getting your poll out there to the people that you actually want to take it and not letting people take it that you don't want to take it is difficult for internet polls. So this whole idea of landline phone use being in decline and cell phones and the internet not being perfect substitutes, that has presented some challenges to pollsters. And there's just a general decline in trust from Americans, trust in their social institutions. And so people answer the phone and hear that it's a pollster on the other end, and they think you're bad, you're fake news, you don't publish the right numbers anyway, and so they just hang up on them. So declining trust also certainly doesn't help get us accurate information, because those people might still vote, but if they don't participate in the polls, we don't have an accurate count um, for their opinion. All right, so let's move on. Let's move from public opinion to political socialization. Let me give you a quick definition. Political socialization is the process by which people develop and pass on their political beliefs. Political socialization is the process by which people develop and pass on their political beliefs. And I'll just say up front, when we think about our political beliefs, a lot of people say, I am rational and I am purely intellectual. I'm not influenced by outside sources because I just consider the evidence coldly, and that's how I reach my political opinions. And that, for the overwhelming majority of voters, is a complete lie. The overwhelming majority of voters mostly develop their political beliefs after being influenced by some of these sources that we're going to talk about. So certainly we are influenced by these sources, and that affects how we see the world. So the number one source of political socialization is your home and your family. That's why there's 7 asterisks here next to that one. That is the most important one, especially if there are 2 parents in the home, and especially if both of them share their political beliefs. It is very likely that their children will come to share those same political beliefs. Not always, but it's most likely. So home and family play a huge role in socializing you politically and helping you develop your political beliefs. Then you start going to school. You go to elementary school, you go to high school, you start meeting people who are similar to you. You start meeting people who are different, have maybe had some different experiences. Maybe you play sports with people who are different from you, or you get involved in activities with different people, and you start meeting people who are different, and that starts shaping how you see the world as well. You might be in a religious organization. Maybe you go to a place of worship, and again, you're meeting different people, you're being exposed to different beliefs. Maybe you're in a civic organization like Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, whatever that may be. And so you start sort of developing some of those political beliefs based on your exposure there. And of course, your peer groups, your friends. That's going to play a role as well. And as you continue, maybe you go to college. Many colleges have a more liberalizing effect, not always, but it's not unusual to go to college and, again, start having independent life experiences as an adult, meeting different people. The media certainly plays a role in this if you start paying attention to the news. What media you choose to expose yourself to is going to play a role in your political socialization. We've got a whole chapter on media coming in the future, and so we'll get more into detail there. But what 24-hour news networks you watch, what podcasts you listen to, who you follow on social media like Twitter and Instagram is going to play a role in your political socialization. There are so many different media sources that what you choose to watch and what you choose to be exposed to is going to say something about your political beliefs, and is also going to nudge you kind of in a direction, one way or another, a little bit to the right, a little bit to the left. Experiences with coworkers, with friends, again, meeting different people with different experiences and talking to them about the world. That's going to help socialize you as well. As you're exposed to political campaigns and you see presidential campaigns, Senate campaigns, House, state, local campaigns all playing out in front of you, you grow up, you start paying taxes, you experience government regulation. I was talking to my brother a little while ago. He started his own business and he was complaining about regulation on small businesses and stuff like that. That is an experience that has shaped him politically because it's something that he has gone through. And so that life experience affects his politics as well. And politics has become more nationalized and certainly more globalized too. Everything feels like a national issue now, especially after 2016. Every state and local election between 2016 and 2020 felt like it was being impacted by President Trump. And so politics became very polarized and very nationalized, so that it wasn't so much about state and local issues anymore. It was about these sort of national issue buzzwords that were being used in politics of every level. And politics have become globalized too. We're certainly paying attention to what's going on around the world and some of these larger political forces that are at work in the world. So all of these have an effect on us personally. All play a role in the political socialization process that happens in each person that helps kind of shape what a person's individual politics will end up being. Over time, Americans have come to trust their government less. Trust in government has basically been in free fall since the 1960s. We're going to look at just a few examples of why that has happened. Certainly, Richard Nixon, our old friend, Richard Nixon didn't help with the Watergate scandal, where it was shown that Nixon was using the power of the presidency to try to corruptly impact a political campaign, right? He's using the power of the presidency in a way that unfairly harms and attacks his political opponents, most notably by having his thugs break into the Watergate Hotel and then offering to use the power of the presidency to pay to cover that up. So Watergate certainly didn't help. The Vietnam War, this extended war, and like I talked about with the Pentagon Papers previously, we found out that multiple administrations had lied about our involvement in Vietnam, had said that we were close to turning a corner, had painted this very rosy picture of Vietnam that turned out not to be true. And with the Pentagon Papers, Americans find out that their government had been lying to them about this war that was costly and ultimately resulted in failure. Racism, seeing the attacks on Black activists during the civil rights movement, seeing the racial uprisings that happened during the civil rights era during the 60s that certainly doesn't help Americans, give them a positive view of their government, leads to declining trust and faith in the government as well. The Clinton impeachment, again, we've got a president caught in a lie, another president being impeached. That leads to more declining faith in our institutions. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, both of them at this point are old enough to vote. They are close to it. I think Iraq might be 17 years and change. And Afghanistan certainly is even a little bit older. Neither one with really any end in sight. So these two wars, neither of which seem to be moving toward a clear goal. That idea of these endless wars has really led to declining faith in government and divided government, gridlock. When Congress fails to act and can't get anything accomplished, then Americans lose faith in it, right? The fact that the filibuster, for example, keeps Congress from really accomplishing any major legislation, that makes Americans feel like, you know what, government's not worth it, it's useless, it's not solving problems. And so, yeah, Americans tend to see divided government as one more reason not to believe that the government can solve problems or that it's working for them. In terms of ideology, we've talked before about conservative, liberal, moderate. Most Americans identify as moderates, independents, centrists, somewhere in the middle. Most Americans identify as moderates, independents, centrists. Um, most of those independents either lean right or left. Most of them we can kind of say tend to vote Republican, tend to vote Democrat, but most Americans do identify as independents or centrists, somewhere in the middle. You don't need to know these exact percentages, but a very small percent identify as extreme left or extreme right. Roughly equal numbers of voters are conservative or liberal. And there are more voters who are registered Democrats. There are more Democrats, but Republican voters tend to be more consistent about showing up to vote. So more voters are registered Democrats, but more Republicans show up to vote. That's especially true in state elections, local elections, primary elections. Republicans are more likely to turn out. Democratic voters are just a little bit more inconsistent than Republican voters are. And if you want to win an election, it means you have to win the middle. You have to win independents. You've got to win centrists. So typically that means if you want to win your primary, if you're a Republican, you got to win conservatives to win your primary. If you're a Democrat, you've got to win liberals to win your primary. But then in the general election, you have to win the middle. You have to win independents. Political efficacy. This is a little bit different from political socialization. Political efficacy is exactly what it says here: a citizen's capacity to understand and influence political events and believe that the system will respond. For political efficacy, it's citizens' belief that they are effective as a citizen, that they can have an effect. So political efficacy is a citizen's ability to follow the news, understand what's going on in the world, and their ability to influence political events by voting, by participating in activism in some other way, calling Congress, or marching, demonstrating, donating to a campaign, participating with an interest group, and their belief that that is effective, that the system will respond to them. You can split this into internal and external efficacy, ability to understand, and belief that the system will respond. But efficacy is different from socialization. Socialization is a process by which our political beliefs are shaped. Efficacy is our capacity to understand and influence political events. And last, we political scientists will sometimes split voters into different groups that have patterns of voting. So these are demographic groups. Sometimes these are called cleavages. These demographic groups that produce general patterns. It's not true 100% of the time for all people who fall into these different groups, but in general, we can look at some patterns of voting. So some important cleavages, some of these demographic groups include race. African American voters tend to consistently be Democratic voters. Again, not always, but they are a reliably Democratic voting bloc. White voters tend to be more conservative, not always true. There are certainly plenty of white liberals. For Latino Americans, it often depends on whether they are first generation, second generation immigrant, or beyond. It often depends on where specifically they trace their heritage back to. Cuban Americans tend to be a little bit more conservative. So race plays a role, certainly. Gender plays a role. Men tend to be a little bit more conservative. Women tend to be a little bit more liberal. Um, Sexual orientation can play a role in political socialization. Religion, I split this into religion and religiosity. So religion, obviously that's what religion you belong to. But religiosity, by this I mean, how active are you in your religion? So religion is, I identify as Christian, Jewish, Muslim, atheist, whatever. Religiosity is, how active are you? Meaning, how often do you participate in activities based around your religion? If you're only going to church on Christmas and Easter, that's going to have a different political impact than a person who's at the church every time it's unlocked. That is, um, so I call that religiosity, how religiously active you are. Those have different roles. There is still a lot of conversation going on around a group that's are commonly called white evangelicals. So kind of combining race and religion. So evangelicalism is a particular type of Protestant Christianity. And so taking white people who identify as evangelical and looking at them as a voting bloc. They tend to be pretty politically conservative compared to, say, white Catholics or white Methodists. Region, where in the country are you from? I listened to a podcast where the host said she was a Texas Democrat, but a New York Republican. When she lived in Texas, she was more liberal than a lot of the people around her. She was way more liberal than the Republicans in Texas. But when she moved to New York, she was way more conservative than all the Democrats and felt like she was a New York Republican. So, region of the country might play a role. Age certainly is going to play a role. Millennials are tending toward being a little bit more liberal, whereas baby boomers are tending to be a little bit more conservative. I don't know enough polling yet about Gen Z, about your generation, to know. My really only experience is anecdotal in the classroom, and obviously that's not a perfect sample, but we can in general say that older Americans are tending toward being a little more conservative, younger tending toward being a little bit more liberal. There's an obvious one, party identification, right? If you're a Democrat, you're going to tend to be a little bit more liberal. You're going to tend to vote for the Democratic candidate. Seems like an obvious one, but that is also one of these cleavages, one of these demographics. And obviously, if you're a Republican, you're going to tend to vote for conservative candidates. And socioeconomic status. I include in that things like not just income, but class and wealth. So income, class, wealth, education we could throw in here as well. All of that kind of fits together into socioeconomic status. So these are ways that we divide up voters to look for patterns in voting. And if you want to go back and look at exit polls, we may do that at some point as a class, look at some exit polls and see how these different groups vote and look for some surprises. So that's everything I wanted to take a look at today. That's all of this whole chapter. We did it all in one day. That's all of public opinion and political socialization all in one day. Good job. And we will pick up with political participation starting tomorrow. So on Tuesday, we will look at chapter 10, political participation, and I'm excited. So I will see you all on Tuesday.